every other Sunday, our house stopped being our house. Before sunrise, my mother rolled up every rug. My brothers carried heavy church benches into the front room, the wood cold under their hands, still smelling faintly of the barn where they'd been stored since the last hosting. By mid-morning, nearly 80 people would be sitting where we'd eaten supper the night before. My father would carry in the last bench himself, even when the boys were already doing the work, even when he didn't need to. And then he'd stand near the window for a moment before he sat down, looking out across the yard, watching the buggies come. I never once saw him simply arrive at church. I always saw him watch it arrive, the way a man climbs down before he helps his wife down, the way a child runs straight for the yard before anyone's told her she can, the way a boy of 14 hesitates near the barn instead of joining the men. And what that hesitation means. My father watched people the way Samuel watched weather. The way I watch wood grain. He took notes afterward in the small composition book with a marbled cover, which he kept in the bottom drawer of his roll-top desk, in a drawer that nobody opened until after he was buried. That's where the story ends. But it doesn't start there. It starts with a boy of 10 standing at the end of a gravel lane on a cold October morning, directing buggies into the yard, watching his father watch everything, and not yet understanding a single thing he was looking at. My name is Eli. I was born in the autumn of 1940 on my grandfather's farm in Lancaster County, in the same room where my own children would later be born, in a bed frame my father made from black walnut he'd cut and cured himself. That bed is still in the house. My daughter sleeps in it now when she visits with her own children, and I think sometimes about how strange it is that a piece of furniture can outlive so many of the people who ever rested in it. We were a family of 9. My father, Amos, my mother, Rebecca, and 7 children. Last, born when I was already 9, came David, who arrived so long after the rest of us that he spent most of his childhood seeming like a single child in a house full of adults, rather than a 7th child in a family that had once been younger together. Our farm sat at the end of a long gravel lane in Lancaster County, 210 acres. A dairy herd. A white clapboard house with a wraparound porch on the south side, built by my great-grandfather, added onto twice, big enough, as it turned out, for what it was eventually asked to hold. I should explain what it means to host church, because if you've never lived inside a church district the way I grew up inside ours, you may not understand why a family would spend weeks preparing for it, or why, when it's done, something in the house feels changed for a long while after, as though the walls themselves have taken note that something important passed through them. We have no church built from the earliest days of our people, going back to the persecutions in the old country before any of our families crossed the ocean. We have held our services inside our own homes, moving from farm to farm within the district so that every family takes its turn hosting, usually once or twice a year, depending on how many households belong to the district. Beds taken apart, dressers pushed against walls, rugs rolled, so that the downstairs rooms stand open enough to hold rows of backless wooden benches that don't belong to any one family but travel from farm to farm inside a long wagon we call the bench wagon. The bench wagon carries its whole cargo of plain wood seats from the previous hosting to the next, which means that every family in the district eventually sits on the same benches, and at the same boards have held the weight of every family's grief and joy and ordinary Sunday together, decade after decade, until the wood is worn smooth from a small unevenness in one leg that somehow survived being shimmed and reshimmed across many years by many well-intentioned hands. Everyone who ever noticed it mentioned it to someone else, and the bench kept rocking anyway, long after I'd forgotten to wonder about it, and long after I should have simply replaced the leg and been done with the whole business. I didn't understand why I kept not replacing it until the day I read my father's notebook. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That autumn I was 10, and word came in early summer that our hosting fell to second Sunday in October. My father brought it to the table like any other piece of farm news, no more, no less. Our hosting was coming. We'd need to be ready. The smell of my mother's kitchen 6 weeks out from the hosting and the smell of it 2 days out were completely different things. 6 weeks out it smelled like any summer kitchen, bread and whatever vegetables had come in from the garden, ordinary and warm. But as October approached, something changed in that smell. A kind of sweet, sharp concentration of canning vinegar and apples and spiced meat. A smell that meant the house was loading itself up, making ready to become something larger than itself, for one long morning. He would pause in the middle of an ordinary task, a hand still holding a jar she'd been lifting to a shelf, eyes looking at nothing in particular, and you'd understand that she was counting something in her head and had lost the count. Polished a certain serving spoon 3 times one evening, setting it down and picking it back up, until my father, passing through without slowing down, said quietly, "Rebecca, it shines already," and she set it down and didn't pick it up again. And the look that crossed her face was something between embarrassment and relief, the look of a person who's been caught showing more worry than they meant to show. "She gets like this before hosting," Anna said to me, not unkindly, later that night. "It always does. Whenever it matters that things go right, she holds too much." And I've thought about the fact that my father, who could see so much else clearly, always seemed to see that particular thing about her most clearly of all. He knew exactly when to say the one quiet word that set the spoon down for good. He never made a ceremony out of it. He never said more than exactly the word she needed. I never thought to ask, while either of them was alive to answer. The bench wagon arrived on the Friday before. My Uncle Levi's team pulled it down our lane mid-morning, and I remember the sound of those wheels on the gravel, heavier than a usual load, the wagon settling low. My father came out of the barn to meet it without being called. The men unloaded the benches one at a time, carrying the men through the front door, and my father walked alongside, not helping exactly, watching. He stopped one of Levi's boys when the 4th bench came off the wagon. "That one rocks," my father said, "back near the wall, where there's less movement." Levi's boy said it where he was told, and moved on to the next one. And I remember watching my father lay one hand on that particular bench for just a moment before he stepped back, a quick touch, like a man checking on something familiar. I thought nothing of it. I thought everything was ordinary that morning. I was wrong about a great many things that morning. The preparation of the house itself, those final 2 days, was a full demolition and reconstruction, and I want to slow down and live in it with you, because the sound of it and the smell of it and the particular confusion of children sent in 4 directions at once is its own kind of story. My father stood in the front room on that Friday afternoon, the bench wagon already unloaded, and looked at the furniture the way a man looks at a river he's about to ford, taking the measure. "Samuel, David, take the low end." David, who was 9 that year, grabbed the low corner before Samuel could get his hands positioned properly, and the sofa lurched sideways and knocked against my mother's side table. "David!" My mother's voice from the kitchen, not loud, somehow traveling exactly as far as it needed to. A piece of furniture moved wrong is worse than one not moved at all. David stepped back, wounded, and Samuel moved in and tilted the sofa correctly and nodded to David. David took his corner again, careful this time, and he worked it up the stairs. From 2 rooms away, I could hear Samuel's quiet voice on the stairs, telling David which foot to lead with, and David's quick replies, not sulky now, entirely focused on the task. Something about real work always brought David back from wherever his feelings had taken him. Ones who come back fastest from frustration are usually the ones who just need something else to think about. Rugs came up and went to the attic, mine and David's job, back and forth across the bare boards, the house becoming echoing and strange with each trip. Without the rugs, the floorboards creaked differently, louder, more bare. My steps sounded too large. He paused a moment and looked at the room himself, at the bare floor and the bare windows, and the morning light coming in without anything in its way. He stood there another moment, longer than the statement seemed to need, his eyes moving slowly around the stripped room, and then he went on, whether he was already, even that Friday, thinking about who would sit where and watching for what. The morning of the hosting itself began at 3. That's not an exaggeration. My mother was in the kitchen by 3, and by the time I came down the stairs at 5, rubbing sleep from my eyes, the stove was loaded and the bread was already rising, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and something sweet in the oven. "Go check the chickens and bring in wood," my mother said without looking up, "and make sure David doesn't stay in bed." He was up late, fussing with the account book. David had been helping my father keep it since he was 7 years old. He'd asked to, which nobody else in the family had ever done. He said the numbers looked lonesome, unattended. I went up and found David not asleep, but sitting on the edge of his bed in the cold room, fully dressed, already wide awake. "About how many people are coming?" he said. "I counted the families in the district. With children, it's at least 81. But some families have had babies since last year, and I'm not sure of the exact number." "I don't like not knowing the exact number." "You could ask Ma'am," I said. "She'll say enough to feed." which is in the number. The first buggies arrived while the light was still gray, and my job that morning was directing them in from the lane. Standing at the fence with my boots wet from the frost on the grass and my breath making small clouds in the cold, David stood beside me with his arms crossed, counting under his breath, not counting the ones already in the house. I didn't ask how he knew some of the buggies held 2 people and some held 5. He just knew. I had stopped being surprised by David's particular variety of knowing by then. The men arrived and gathered in clusters near the barn, talking in low voices, greeting each other with handshakes, their plain black coats dark against the pale morning. The women moved toward the house with a quieter directness, bringing their covered dishes in through the side door, stopping to embrace my mother in the kitchen, saying ordinary things to her, things about the bread smell and the pie and the way the house looked. Ordinary things that somehow added up, by the weight of how many people said them, to something meaningful. He shook every hand. He asked after every family. But even while he was talking to one person, some part of him was watching something else, his eyes moving across the yard in the particular way I was beginning, that year, to recognize as his way. He was watching Samuel, I realized after a while, not obviously, not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but steadily. Samuel was out near the pasture gate, helping one of the arriving families unhitch their horse, and he was talking to the young husband while he worked, the 2 of them moving through the task together with the easy comfort of men who shared similar work. My father watched that for almost a full minute, and then he turned away and went on with his own conversation, and whatever he'd been thinking didn't show on his face at all. I had a thought, standing there 10 years old, that I couldn't quite shape into words. What that something was, I couldn't have told you. I noticed it that October morning and noticed it again at the next 2 hostings and the one after that. And never once, until I read the notebook, did I understand why. I only knew that by the time the bishop's gray horse finally turned down our lane that October, the yard was full of buggies and the house was already murmuring with the sound of 80 people settling into their places. And Bishop Fisher came in at a walk, unhurried, as though the fact of his lateness required no explanation to anyone, and he was not inclined to offer one. He shook my father's hand in the yard, and they stepped aside together for a moment, the 2 of them near the fence while everyone else moved toward the house. My father said something back. The bishop looked toward the house and then looked at my father and put one hand briefly on my father's arm, and then they both walked inside. Just 2 old friends stalking your fence before a church service. I would have forgotten it entirely except that I saw it happen again. At the Beeler hosting in November, the same 2 men, the same fence, the same brief exchange. And I started to wonder whether it was ordinary neighborly talk or whether it was something else. And I never found out. And the wondering stayed with me like a splinter, too small to locate but present enough to notice whenever you pressed on it. The service itself lasted 3 hours, as always. And I want to tell you what it actually feels like to sit for 3 hours on a backless wooden bench if you've never done it, because most people haven't. In the first hour, you are comfortable enough. In the second hour, you've found every possible way to shift your weight, and none of them have made any real difference. By the third hour, you learned, if you haven't learned it already, to let the body settle and the mind go somewhere else entirely. We sang from the Alsband, the old hymnal, some of its hymns written centuries before any of us were born. When you draw each syllable out long and let it rest in the air of the room, something happens in the space between the notes that does not happen at any faster pace. I've never had a better word for what that something is than simply presence. Bishop Fisher preached that morning on the parable of the talents. The servant given 5, the servant given 2, the servant given 1. He spoke for the better part of an hour, slowly, in the way elderly preachers sometimes slow as they near the end of their long years of preaching, as if they are finally saying only what matters most and no longer in any hurry to say even that. I sat between my father and Samuel. The rocking bench was not the one we were on that morning, but I could see it from where I sat, in the back row near the wall, and at some point during the second sermon I watched it rock very slightly as an old man in that row shifted his weight. Nobody around him seemed to notice. The bench did what it had always done, exactly as much as it intended to and no more. My father, at one point during the silent prayer, turned his head very slightly toward me, not looking at me exactly, but near me. I only knew that I felt it, the way you feel someone's attention even when your eyes are closed, and that when I opened my eyes, he had already turned back toward the front of the room, and his face was entirely still. After the service came the FASPA, and I want to tell you about it not because anything unusual happened, but because it was one of the first times I truly understood that our whole community was one body doing one thing. That be spread across many households that had learned, across generations, how to act as a single household when it needed to. The benches folded down into tables, a thing I had seen before, but which still seemed like a small miracle each time. Long boards becoming long tables in the span of 10 minutes, and my mother and the other women moved through the rooms with a speed that felt unrehearsed, but couldn't possibly have been. Jars of chow chow and pickled beets came out of baskets that families had carried in with them on arrival, everyone knowing, without being told, what the hosting family would need supplemented. A plate of cookies appeared that nobody in our family had baked. A second jar of apple butter, twice the size of ours. A small boy, maybe 4 years old, reached for his cup of coffee and caught the rim wrong, and it tipped and fell, and the sound of it hitting the bench table was a very small sound, but everything near it went quiet for an instant, and the boy's face crumpled, and his mother, calm as weather, simply lifted him and wiped the table with a cloth she happened to have in her apron pocket, and handed him a piece of bread instead, and the small quiet dissolved back into the larger sound of 80 people talking. And nobody mentioned it again. An old woman near the window, Sarah Zook's grandmother, who must have been close to 90 that year, had found the same seat she seemed to favor at every hosting I could remember, the window seat on the aisle, with the light came in from the south. I noticed her watching my mother more than once that afternoon, the way old women watch young women managing the household, not critically, with something more like recognition, the kind of watching that says, I have done exactly what you are doing, and it ends, and you will not regret it. My father, at some point in the afternoon, stepped outside with Bishop Fisher. They stood near the fence again. I watched them from the window. My father was nodding at something the bishop was saying, and then he said something himself. Just a few words, and the bishop smiled, which was unusual, the bishop being a man whose face generally traveled between serious and more serious and only visited pleasant on special occasions. Then they came back inside, and my father crossed the room to where Samuel was standing, talking with a neighbor about the corn harvest, and stood beside his oldest son for a while without saying anything, just listening, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes on Samuel's face. Samuel didn't notice. He was deep in his corn conversation. He had the gift of attention in conversation, too, giving whoever he was speaking with the feeling that the topic at hand was the most important one in the county. My father watched him for nearly 5 minutes. Then he walked on, and the afternoon continued. And the last buggies didn't leave until after 4, and we spent the evening returning the house to itself, and I fell asleep tired, satisfied, and not thinking about any of it. It was only later, turning it over, that I wondered what my father had been looking for. That evening after supper, after the last of the furniture had been dragged back from the attic and the rugs unrolled and the kitchen set to rights, after the children had all gone up, I came back downstairs for water, which I sometimes did, and which sometimes also meant I wanted to see what was still moving in the house at that hour. I had seen him write at that desk many times. Farm accounts, letters to relatives in Ohio, the occasional note to the bishop about district business. He was writing slowly, the pen pausing between lines, the way a person writes when they are choosing words rather than simply recording. I slowed just slightly without meaning to and caught one line before he shifted the book. Something with Samuel's name at the top. I would back upstairs and lay in bed for a while before sleep, listening to the quiet house. November came, and with it a church Sunday, not at our farm, but at the Beelers. And this one I want to tell you about because it looked nothing like our hosting in October, and because hosting church teaches you things about your neighbors that ordinary visits never quite reveal. The lane at the Beeler farm ran downhill from the road, a gentle enough slope in dry weather, but we'd had a week of rain, and I remember our own buggy sliding slightly going down it. My father working the brake with the quiet, focused attention he brought to things that required. Big gray gelding belonging to one of the more distant families went down on its knees in the mud partway, and I heard the sound of it from inside our buggy, and we all looked out, and the horse was already scrambling back up before any of the men could reach it. Unhurt, but loudly offended, Mud Street and snorted. The owner said something back, and then everyone moved on. Because that is what you do when something frightens you and then resolves itself into nothing serious. You laugh and move on and remember the thing later with more warmth than the moment itself probably warranted. Inside the Baylor house, the cold came with us through the door. There was something about that particular November Sunday that the Baylor house, warm as it was made, couldn't entirely keep out. A cold that pressed in at the windows and settled in the corners and made everyone crowd a little closer together than usual on the benches, not minding the closeness, actually grateful for it. I noticed a young couple near the back, sitting with the careful distance of people who were new to sitting in the same room together, but not yet entirely at ease with it. They were recently married, I learned later, and this was their first hosting Sunday as husband and wife, still seated in the separated men's and women's sections, the way we always sat, but glancing toward each other every few minutes with a small, involuntary frequency of people who have not yet learned to take the other's presence for granted. I didn't know quite what to do with them, the way a person doesn't, who hasn't yet built up the habit of Sunday stillness across enough years to make it automatic. Set them on the bench beside him, and then lift them back. He greeted my father in the lane outside the house, and they spoke, but briefly this time, no fence conference. Just a handshake and a few words before they went in. My father sat ahead of me and to the left, and at one point during the service I watched him watching the young couple's restless newlywed hands, and there was something in his expression that I can only describe now, from this distance, as recognition, the look of a man who sees something he was expecting to see. On the long ride home, the rain starting up again by the time we turned onto our road, my father said, without any particular context, when Samuel was married last spring, he held still through the whole service. First Sunday after his wedding, never fidgeted once. I thought about this. Different men show themselves differently, he said. The quiet ones show themselves in stillness. The busy-handed ones show themselves in motion. You know what I've never seen either you or Samuel do during a service? I didn't know what to make of that. So I said nothing, and we rode home in the rain, and I fell almost asleep against the side panel of the buggy, and I didn't think about it again for a long while. But I didn't forget it either. The announcement happened on a Sunday evening in December. I remember the supper before it clearly enough, though I didn't know at the time that there was anything particular to remember. Potato soup, which my mother made when the cold came in earnest, with bread from that morning and butter. David spilled his milk and caught the cup before it left the table and looked so pleased with himself about it that Miriam laughed out loud, and even my father smiled. A quick one, gone almost before it arrived. The lamp was low. The stove was warm and ordinary, and he closed it and set it back on the shelf and sat in his chair, and the room changed slightly, the way a room changes when the person in it has something more to say than usual. And what happens to it when I'm no longer able to work it? He looked at David first, and then at me, and then at Samuel. Not the surprise of it exactly. Not at first, because the mind takes a moment to sort that kind of announcement into the proper categories. I remember the sound of the fire in the stove. I remember David still holding his toy horse, the small wooden one he'd had since he was 4, turning it over in his hands the way he turned everything over when he was thinking. I can't fully explain tonight, my father said. I know that's hard. I'm asking you to trust something that isn't fully visible yet. I haven't overlooked you, my father said. I want you to hold on to that. He picked up the conversation and moved it elsewhere. Something about the Northfield, and the evening continued, and nobody brought up the announcement again that night. David himself looked up from his toy horse after a moment and said, entirely matter-of-fact, I don't want the farm. I want to count this. Later, in the kitchen, I asked my mother what she knew. When he's ready for the rest to be known, he'll make it known. The breadcloth went over the bowl at his own pace. Go to bed, she said, not unkindly. Some questions answer themselves, given enough time. I'm going to tell you about my brother Samuel properly before I go further, because he is one of the great quiet presences of this story, and I don't want you to understand him only through the shape of what he didn't receive. Samuel was not a man of unusual words. He was a man of unusual attention. He gave his attention to whatever he was doing with an intensity that looked, from the outside, like simple focus, but was something more than that. He could stand at a fence line at dusk and tell you the weather 2 days out. Not because he had studied weather, because he had spent his whole life listening to it. How do you know these things? I asked him once, in late October of that year, the two of us working our way through the corn harvest, the stalks dry and rattling around us, our husking pegs aching in the cold. I don't know that I know them, Samuel said. He threw an armload of ears into the wagon. I think I just pay attention, same as you pay attention to your wood. I'm 10. You run your thumb along a board before you cut it, Samuel said. Did you know that? You do it every time without thinking. I've watched you. That's just how you're made. I thought about what it meant that my older brother had been watching me the way I was only just learning that my father watched things, and how I had never once noticed either of them doing. About my thumb. Dad knows everything, Samuel said without looking up, which I thought at the time was a slight exaggeration, and came to understand across many years was more nearly accurate than anything else I could have said about my father. David's particular gift showed itself that same autumn in a way I've always remembered for the gentleness of it. He came to my father one November evening with the farm's account ledger under his arm, which was not unusual since he'd been keeping it since he was 7, and he set it on the kitchen table and pointed to a column near the bottom of the November page. It wasn't in October either, David said. I went back and looked. It's been missing since September, and I don't know where it went, but it's wrong. Then he sat down across from David and said, "Show me where you started looking." And David walked him through it. Every step, his small finger moving down the column, his voice steady and certain in the particular way of a person explaining something they know completely. And my father listened the whole way through without interrupting once. And when David finished, my father said, "You're right. I miscounted the milk receipts in September. I'll fix it." David nodded, satisfied, and closed the ledger and tucked it back under his arm and went upstairs to bed. My father sat at the table a long while after that, the lamp still on. I passed through on my way to bed and saw him sitting there, not writing, not reading, just sitting, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a man watching a thing he expected become the thing he expected. I went upstairs without saying anything. I thought he was thinking about the farm ledger. Spring of that year, I turned 11, and my father began, without ceremony, sending me to help our neighbor Jacob Beeler on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Jacob was a cabinet maker, and he took on boys from the district the way certain tradesmen do, informally, by invitation, working them into the shop and seeing what they were made of and either keeping them coming back or gently finding some other use for their afternoon. "Your father's," she said. "Why Jacob's shop, at least for now?" "You haven't run out," I said, which was true. He knew 10 times what I knew about wood and tools. "That's not the same as running out. I want you to learn them instead." I told Jacob my father had sent me on my first afternoon at the shop, and Jacob looked at me for a long moment, his hands still on whatever he'd been working on, and said, "Well, Amos Fisher. All right, that smelled different, sharper, more resinous, sawdust deep in the corners. The tools were older than anything my father owned, some of them inherited, I later learned, from Jacob's own father and his father before that. The hand planes were worn smooth with generations of palms. The chisels had been sharpened so many times they were half the blade they'd started as, thin and impossibly keen. Feel the bevel. It felt different, dull against the fingertip in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to mistake. "Because you can feel the edge," Jacob said. "Because the edge is there to be felt. A dull tool makes you work harder and gives you less for it. A sharp tool does the work and you just got it. That's what sharp looks like," he said. "That's what you're working toward, every time, every tool. Don't accept less. Most of them are sharp. One wasn't. I sharpened the one that wasn't, carefully, the way Jacob had shown me, and when I was done, I ran my thumb over it again and felt the difference. And something in me was satisfied in a way I didn't have words for yet. My father found me in the workshop that evening, the sharpened tool in my hand. "Did Jacob show you that?" he said. "Yes," I said. He took the tool from me and ran his own thumb along the bevel. He handed it back. "Good," he said, and went inside, and I remember standing in the workshop alone for a moment after he left, holding the sharpened chisel, feeling the particular pleasure of having done something well according to a standard I had just learned existed and that I had not known to look for before. The knowledge that the standard is there and that reaching it matters. Our next turn to host church came the following autumn, when I was 11, because I've come to believe that hosting church is one of those experiences that teaches you something new about yourself and your family every time, and that the lesson is never quite the same twice. The weather that year was warmer than usual for October, and my father made the decision to put some of the benches in the barn rather than crowding all of them into the house, opening the big side doors so the air could move between the two spaces. This was not unheard of, but it was uncommon, and I remember hearing some of the arriving families remark on it, appreciatively, since it was a beautiful morning in the barn, freshly cleaned and smelling of good wood and hay. rather than the cows who'd been moved to the far pasture, was genuinely pleasant. My father, I noticed, had chosen which family sat inside and which family sat in the barn with a quiet deliberateness that I couldn't quite reverse engineer at the time. The elderly members all inside near the stove, the young families with small children near the barn doors where a restless child could slip out without disrupting the service, the young men, Samuel among them, along the near side of the barn where they'd be visible from both the barn and the house, as though my father had specifically arranged for Samuel to be visible, which I've since come to suspect he had. Bishop Fisher arrived last. Again, I had now seen this happen often enough that I no longer registered it as strange. He arrived last, and he and my father spoke near the fence, and then they came in, and the service began. What was different that year was the FASPA. During the meal, a toddler from one of the neighboring families fell asleep in her mother's arms, deeply, completely, with the total surrender only small children manage, her cheek against her mother's shoulder, her fist curled around a small piece of bread she'd been holding when sleep took her. The mother sat perfectly still for the remainder of the meal, not wanting to wake her, eating with one hand, accepting her coffee with a gratitude that had nothing to do with coffee. 3 different women, over the course of the next hour, came and offered to take the child so the mother could eat properly. She was happy exactly as she was. My mother, passing through, saw this and, without a word, rearranged 2 plates on the table nearest the mother, so everything was within one-handed reach, and moved on. The mother glanced up and caught my mother's eye and nodded, and my mother nodded back, and that was the whole conversation. I remember watching that exchange, and then looking for my father, the way I'd started doing at every hosting, just to see what he was looking at. Samuel was outside in the yard, near the barn, talking to a young man from a neighboring district, laughing at something. The easy laugh of a young man on a fine October morning with nowhere he needed to be for an hour, deeply comfortable in his own skin. My father watched him for a moment, and then did something I had not seen him do at the previous hosting. He opened the composition notebook standing right there near the barn doorway and wrote something in it. Just a few lines. Closed it. Went inside. I stared at the doorway where he'd been for a moment after he was gone. I thought about mentioning it to my mother. I didn't. I thought about asking Samuel if he noticed. I stored it away the way you store away something you don't know what to do with yet, and went back to my own duties, and the afternoon continued, and life went on. I want to slow down the years, a little here the way my father slowed down, I think, when he watched us, not to make them dramatic, but to give them the weight they deserve. Too many lives get summarized. Mine is not going to be one of them. At least not this evening while I have a quiet house and nowhere to be. My apprenticeship with Jacob Beaver stretched from the time I was 11 until I was nearly 17, and those years shaped my hands in a way that has never fully left them. The left palm has a ridge of callus along the base of the fingers that was put there by the handles of hand planes over thousands of hours of practice, and that ridge has never gone away. Not even now. 86 years old, when my hands move through the wood more slowly and rest more often. Jacob was not a tender teacher. He did not praise unnecessarily. He corrected mistakes directly, without cushioning. And when something was done right, he said so briefly and moved on. And you understood that the right was the reward, and the praise was just the notification. "You're starting to feel it," he said to me once, maybe 2 years into the apprenticeship. We had been working on a cabinet, a walnut one, joined without nails, and I had spent an afternoon fitting 2 pieces together at a joint that I'd cut and recut until the fit was nearly invisible. "The difference between working the wood and letting it work," he said. "You didn't find it. That's what I mean by feeling it." My father came to pick me up at the end of that particular afternoon, unusual since I ordinarily walked, and Jacob came out with me, which was also unusual since Jacob generally stayed with his work until the natural end of it. The 2 men greeted each other, and Jacob said to my father, without preamble, "He's learning to let the wood work." Maybe less. Until what? I asked, because I did not understand what they were estimating. He looked at my father, and something passed between them that I could feel without being able to name. More than fine. My father nodded, and we went to the buggy, and on the ride home he did not explain what Jacob had meant or why the conversation had happened. He simply drove, quiet in the particular way he was quiet when something had settled into place in his thinking. I didn't ask. I was learning, slowly, that some things my father would answer and some things he would hold until he was ready to release them, and that asking before he was ready only made him more careful, not more forthcoming. That winter, I was 15, and I remember a particular Tuesday morning in February. The kind of cold that gets into the barn even through solid walls. Finding my father at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, both hands wrapped around his coffee. Looking out the window at the dark, I got myself a cup and sat down across from him, and we sat there together in the quiet kitchen while the stove worked on warming the room. Neither of us speaking, watching the dark outside begin its slow change toward gray. After a while, my mother came downstairs and the day started properly and nothing was said about the sitting. But I remember it the way you remember certain silences, as something that was itself a kind of conversation. Samuel married Lydia the autumn I turned 14, and I want to tell you about the hosting Sunday they attended together afterward, as newlyweds, because it connects to a great many things. It was the Zook farm that year, a late November hosting, and Samuel and Lydia arrived together in Samuel's own buggy, which was new that year. His wedding buggy, the particular straightness with which Samuel sat in the front, and the small, quick look he gave Lydia before he handed her down, and the way she adjusted her cap before she stepped into the yard without needing to look at her hands to do it. They sat in their separated sections through the service the way we all sat, men and women apart, but I had a clear view of both of them from where I sat, and I spent more time than I should have during the sermon, watching them rather than watching the bishop. Samuel sat entirely still for 3 hours. Every time I looked, he was still, not rigid, not stiff, simply still, a man for whom the practice of Sunday sitting had become, across years, as natural as breathing. Lydia, beside the other women, was still too, her eyes forward, her hands folded, steady in the way of someone who had prepared herself for what was expected of her and met it afterward at the FOSPA. Samuel set his plate down and went directly to help an old man he didn't know personally, someone whose wife was struggling to carry both their plates at once, and he picked up one plate without asking and walked alongside them to a seat without making any ceremony of the act. I found my father at my elbow, appearing from somewhere, the composition notebook in his coat pocket, the shape of it visible. My father nodded, not taking his eyes off Samuel across the room. And then, after a moment, "That's what I mean." He walked away before I could ask him what he meant by it. There are small domestic things I want to give you from those years, because a life on a farm is built as much from small things as from large ones. And the small things are what I remember most truly. My mother sewing always, her needle moving in the lamplight with the same unconscious rhythm as breathing. My father reading, sometimes the Bible, sometimes the budget, sometimes the almanac, his voice, when he read aloud, giving each word exactly the weight it carried. David with the account books, even on ordinary evenings, going over figures that had nothing to do with any current task, simply because the figures interested him. The kitchen on a cold morning, the particular company of my mother and my sisters, Anna frying mush at the stove, Miriam slicing bread, Ruth setting the table with the swift confidence of someone who had set the same table 5,000 times and was not interested in doing it any more slowly just because she could. My mother tasting something from a spoon and making a small sound, not of approval exactly, of recognition. The evenings in the workshop, my father and I sometimes, or me alone, once I had my own sense of what I was working toward, the smell of sawdust and the lamp oil, and outside the barn, the far-off sound of the horses settling for the night, the particular silence of a country property after the working part of the day is done. My grandmother, in the last years of her life, sitting by the downstairs window with her mending, her eyes no longer keen enough for fine work, but her hands refusing to be idle. She called me over once and handed me a shirt with a torn seam. "Thread this for me," she said. "My eyes aren't what they were." I threaded the needle and handed it back, and she worked the mend slowly, her stitches larger now than they'd once been. "Your grandfather built that rocking chair," she said, nodding toward the chair across the room. "You have to give it less than it wants, or it takes everything." She looked up at me. She looked at me with the particular patience of very old women who have learned that younger people ask questions before they're ready for the answers. "You'll understand it when it's time to understand it," she said, and went back to her mending, and I was left standing there with the feeling that I'd just been told something important in a language I didn't yet speak. The year I turned 16, I helped with my first full barn raising, and I want to tell you about it. Not because it was unusual, but because it was the first time I fully understood, in my body rather than just in my thinking, what a community actually means. The Hoover barn burned on a Thursday night in July. Lightning, dry summer, and the thing was ash by morning except for the stone foundation. 2 horses lost, the family standing in the yard at dawn, looking at what remained. Word went through the district in less than a day. By Saturday, Lumber had begun arriving. By the following Thursday, more than 100 men were at the Hoover place before 7 in the morning. I was put on the framing crew, which was a large trust for a boy of 16. And I remember Jacob Beeler checking my work at each step, not because he doubted me, but because checking is the habit of good craftsmen, and the best teachers maintain it regardless of how much they trust you. "Don't let it hurry you," Jacob said, when I was working a corner joint against the clock of other men's progress all around us. "Hurrying in carpentry is how you get a barn that sags in 10 years. Do it right the first time." I slowed down. The joint came out true. By noon, the frame stood complete. By evening, the roof was on. I stood at the edge of the Hoover yard in the gold late light and looked at the thing that had existed that morning only as lumber and goodwill. And I felt something I still don't have a proper word for, something in the range of gratitude and wonder at what it means to be among people who simply appear without being asked more than once and do what needs doing. My father appeared at my elbow. "Good day," he said. "Good day," I agreed. He looked at the barn for a moment, and then at me. "Same corner gave me trouble on the last barn I framed," he said. If I hadn't needed to farm instead, I was 16, and I understood, finally, that he had once been a boy whose hands wanted something, and that the farm had answered before the hands could speak up for themselves. And I understood, for the first time but not the last, that there was something quietly heartbreaking about that, even in a man who had made peace with it completely and who would not have changed the larger shape of his life for anything. He walked on, and I stood there a moment longer watching the new barn in the evening light and didn't say anything and didn't need to. I want to tell you about my own courtship, because it connects to the hosting in a way that feels important to me now, having lived long enough to see the threads. I met Sarah at a youth singing the summer I turned 19. Held at the Zook farm 2 districts over. She was sitting near the window, and I noticed her before she noticed me, the way you notice a person who is paying close attention to something. There being a quality of stillness in a person who is truly listening that stands out in a room full of ordinary social motion. She was listening to another girl tell a story and not performing the listening the way people sometimes do, but actually doing it. Her eyes on the other girl's face, her hands still in her lap, and I thought, watching her from across the room, that I very much wanted to be on the receiving end of that particular kind of attention. She said something that has stayed with me across 60-some years with the clarity of a thing said once and heard perfectly. "You're the one who builds things," she said, more statement than question. "I try to," I said. "Who told you that?" "Nobody had to," she said. "You've got sawdust in your hair." "Occupational hazard," I said, which made her laugh. A real laugh. Unguarded, the laugh of a person who finds something genuinely funny rather than performing politeness, and I remember thinking in that instant that I wanted to make her laugh like that again, as many times as I could manage across a whole life. I courted her for nearly 2 years. Sunday evenings, the long drives home under more stars than I've ever seen since we moved closer to town. One evening she asked me what I wanted from a whole life, not just the work or the farm or the courting, the whole of things a family uses for 100 years without thinking twice about who made them. "I don't need my name remembered. I just want the work itself to hold. That's different from what most men want," she said. "Is that good or bad?" I said. "That's the only part that worries me." I've thought about that sentence many times since. I haven't always done it as well as she deserved. We married when I was 21, in a wedding not so different from Samuel's, though smaller. My father gave us 2 acres as a wedding gift, and I built our house on it in the first year of our marriage, my own hands on every timber. Sarah teasing me, more than once, that she'd married a man who was more patient with wood than he'd ever been with her. We attended our first hosting Sunday as a married couple that autumn, at an elderly widower's home, and I want to tell you about it because it was the hosting at which I first experienced from the inside what I had only ever watched from the outside before, the particular quality of sitting in the congregation as half of a new household rather than as a child of an existing one. Sarah sat in the women's section, as always, 3 rows ahead and to my left, in a seat where I could see the profile of her face if I looked that direction, which I tried not to do too obviously. I was better at sitting still than the young husband I'd watched at the Buellers years before, but I was not, that morning, as still as I ordinarily was. Something in the back of my attention kept returning to those 3 rows ahead and to the left. At the FASPA, my father found me near the door and handed me a cup of coffee. He looked across the room toward Sarah, who was helping one of the older women find a seat. guiding her gently to a chair with the patient care of someone who had grown up in a house where such things were done without ceremony. "She's good," my father said. "I know she is," I said. "I don't mean good in general," he said. "I mean she's good in the particular way that matters for the life you're going to build. She watches people the way you watch wood. You'll have to remember that. Over the years, she sees things you'll miss because your eyes are on the work." And whether that was a caution or a compliment, and decided by the time I'd finished the coffee that it was probably both, and that he was almost certainly right. The hosting rotations continued across those years, as they always do, the bench wagon making its slow circuit of the district, farm to farm, season to season. I hosted at my own house many times across our married life, and each one was different enough from the last to carry its own particular memory, and similar enough to all the others to feel like the same essential thing every time. I want to tell you about one of those middle years hostings, held on a rainy day in late spring, because it shows you something about my mother that I couldn't have seen as a child. We had 40-some families that year, and the rain that morning was a steady, serious rain, not a gentle one, and the lane had turned to considerable mud by the time the later arrivals came down it, and the porch was wet, and my mother stood inside the front door greeting people with the same warm efficiency she always brought to hosting, and also with a fresh cloth in her hand with which she quietly wiped the door frame each time the door swung open and left a smear of mud on the white paint. Midway through the FOSPA, a child knocked a full cup of coffee off the makeshift bench table, and the sound of it, sharp and liquid, made the nearest people go quiet for an instant, and the child looked up with a face preparing itself for whatever consequence was coming. And my mother was there, it seemed, before the cup had fully stopped rolling, a cloth in her hand, the mess already being addressed, and she said to the child, quietly, "No harm done," which was almost true, the coffee having missed the child's dress by an inch, and the child's face rearranged itself from braced to merely relieved, and life went on. Afterward, when the last family had gone and Sarah and I were helping my mother restore the house, I said to her, "You never seem frightened when things go wrong at hosting." She was folding a tablecloth with the precise automatic movements of a person who has folded the same cloth enough times that her hands know the way without instruction. She considered this. "I was terrified the first time," she said, "the very first hosting, years before you were old enough to remember it. Thought about everything I could go wrong. Right up until the moment the first family came down the lane. And then they came, and it went wrong in 3 small ways, and none of them mattered. And I realized that what I'd been frightened of was judgment, that people would go home thinking less of me. Nobody was paying that kind of attention. They were just there to be the church. And once I understood that, the rest of it became simple. The discovery that most of what we fear in public life is judgment, that most of the people around us are simply too absorbed in their own concerns to deliver. I should tell you about the years of my father's own slow pulling back from the farm's daily work, because they were not sad. Though I know that a man who has worked the land with his hands his whole life and then must feel the loss of it in a way I'm probably only beginning to understand now myself. He turned the morning milking over to Samuel formally around the time I was in my early 30s. He took to spending his mornings on the porch when the weather allowed, and in the workshop when it didn't. Not my workshop, his own. The one he'd kept up across all the years since his own father's tools had passed to him, though he worked in it more slowly now and spent more time sitting with a piece of wood in his hands, feeling the grain than actually cut. Her and I would drive over on a Sunday afternoon, our own children growing toward their own shapes across those years, and my father would sit on the porch or in the kitchen and ask after the work and the children and occasionally the wider community. And between the asking and the answering, there would be stretches of comfortable quiet that are, I think, one of the privileges of a long shared history with a person. The ability to be silent together without any restlessness on either side. It went with him when he drove to church in the inside pocket of his coat. If anything, with fewer daily tasks demanding his attention, his watching had grown more concentrated, more visible. He watched my children specifically, I noticed, more than he watched me. "What do you see in them?" I asked him once, directly, catching him in one of his long observations of my youngest son, who was sitting on the steps whittling a small horse from a piece of scrap walnut. "Same thing I've always seen in children," he said finally. "What they already are, before the world has finished telling them who they're supposed to be. Everything's still visible. Nothing's been closed off yet. Don't let anything talk him out of using them. I looked at my son on the steps and then back at my father and said, "No, my mother died in the spring. I turned 46, and I want to give her death the same small, honest attention she gave to everything in her life, which is to say, not too much ceremony and not too little." She'd been ill for several years before the end, her heart failing slowly, the way things fail when they've been working hard for a long time and simply arrive at the end of their capacity. She never called it heart failure herself. She said her strength wasn't what it had been, which was true, and that she needed to sit more often, which she did, and that she hoped people wouldn't make too much of a fuss, which nobody managed to do to her satisfaction. I visited her more often in those last years, driving over from our place most weeks, and I remember those visits with the particular clarity that comes from knowing, while they're happening, that they are finite. Dad in the rocking chair near the window. She always had something in her hands, mending or knitting, or simply a piece of cloth she was turning over between her fingers, unable to be entirely idle even when the strength for actual work wasn't there. Weather. The children's news. Whatever work I had on the bench that week. "Tell me about what you're building," she said almost every visit, and I always did, describing the piece in whatever detail I had, and she would listen with her eyes partly closed, nodding at intervals, and I would realize, somewhere in the description, that she wasn't really listening to the details, but to something underneath them, the pleasure in my voice when I talked about the work, the way a mother listens for the note of a child's voice rather than the words. She died early on a Sunday morning, gently in her sleep, surrounded in her final days by more people than could comfortably fit in the house, though we all tried anyway, understanding that she would have found any smaller gathering somewhat insulting. My father, in the days after her death, was the same man he had always been, outwardly steady and quiet and present for whatever needed doing. And it was only in the unguarded moments, catching him stand in the kitchen doorway looking at her empty rocking chair, one hand resting flat on the door frame as though he needed the steadiness of it, that I understood the size of what he was carrying. I didn't interrupt those moments. I stepped back from the doorway and let him have them. There are kinds of grief that cannot be helped, only witnessed from a respectful distance. Samuel and Lydia moved into the main house with him gradually, which was the right thing, and by his final years, Samuel's own grown sons were doing most of the daily farm work, and my father spent his mornings on the porch and his afternoons in the workshop. And the composition notebook went on living in his coat pocket, though I noticed, on my visits, that he seemed to be reading it more than writing in it, sitting with it open in his lap rather than putting words in. "Reading back more now," he said. "At my age, looking back is better than looking forward generally. Better view. That's either reassuring or boring, depending on how you look at it." He smiled, the faint one. "You and Samuel both. When it's time, you'll know." I didn't ask again after that. I understood finally that the notebook was a thing with its own timing, and that my father would not be rushed on it any more than he'd ever been rushed on anything else in his life. Chest cold in January that settled into his lungs with the particular stubbornness of illness meeting age, and held on and did not let go. We brought in the doctor. My father took the medicines given to him without argument, which told me, more than anything else, that he understood how serious it was, since he was not ordinarily a man who accepted medical intervention without at least asking why. I drove over nearly every day once it became clear how things were going. Our conversations were slower than they'd once been, my father needing to rest between sentences sometimes, and I learned to sit comfortably in those rests rather than filling them. He told me, one afternoon in early March, the snow falling soft outside, that he'd built 2 of the benches in the district's traveling set himself, years before I was born, before the farm had taken all his spare hours. 3rd and 6th in the stack, he said. Black walnut. Probably been repaired a dozen times since. I've thought about that leg more than once across the years. I never knew why. He smiled. Some things a man holds on to past when it would be sensible to set them down. The imperfect things especially, the ones he made with his own young hands before he knew quite enough to make them right. He said to me later that same afternoon, "The notebook is in the bottom drawer of the desk, locked. Samuel has the key, though I haven't told him that yet. There are things I wanted to tell you directly," he said, "and didn't because I didn't know how to say them without making them into a bigger thing than they needed to be. I wrote them down instead. It seemed better, less formal. I hope I mostly managed it." He died 11 days later, early on a Wednesday morning, Samuel and Lydia present. I built his coffin from black walnut. It seemed right. Same wood my grandfather had used for the bed we were all born in. I worked those boards across 4 days, fitting the joints in the old way, without name. And I remember thinking that this was the truest thing my hands had ever made. Bishop Fisher, who was elderly himself by then, delivered the burial sermon, brief and honest, the way my father would have wanted. The notebook sat in a locked drawer through the spring. Samuel called me in late April, 6 weeks after the funeral. He said he'd found a key among our father's things, a small brass one, and that he understood what it opened, and that he'd been waiting for the right day. And would I come? I went the following Sunday afternoon, and we sat together at the old roll-top desk in the front room where the church benches had stood so many years ago on so many hosting Sundays, and Samuel turned the key in the lock, and the drawer opened. The notebook was smaller than I had imagined it. A plain composition book, the cover worn at the corners, the spine slightly cracked from years of opening and closing. My father's name was not on it, nothing on the outside but the fabric of the cover itself. Samuel turned to the first page and read it aloud slowly. October. He said he didn't know he knew. I believe the year of our first big hosting, the year of the December announcement. Samuel read the entries one by one slowly, with long pauses in between. Some were one line. David counted fence posts on the walk to school again. 31. He told me at supper Levi's team to a shoe on the South Road. Lost half the afternoon. Rebecca says we need another coffee pot before the next hosting. She is right. Bench still rocks. Didn't fix it. Some were 2 lines. Ellie at the workbench today after the hosting. He did not speak the whole hour. Pipes in the milk house froze. He said the same thing he said before, that the land seems to be waiting for Samuel the same way a man's house waits for him to come home, that it knows him. I told him I'd begun to think the same. He said, give him time, Amos. Don't settle it before it settles itself. I said, I know. He said he knew I knew. Samuel stopped reading at that one. He set the notebook down again, flat on his palm, and pressed his other hand against it. He talked about me with Bishop Fisher, Samuel said. That's what the fence conversations were. He was asking the bishop to watch us too, to have another pair of eyes. I never knew what. The entries about Miriam noted her knowledge of plants and remedies, observed across years with the patience of a man watching a tree grow. About Ruth, a single line. Ruth finishes other people's sentences, not because she is impatient, but because she has already arrived at the end before they have. She will always be ahead of whatever conversation she's in. About Katie, she forgives quickly. This is underrated in a person. I've watched it all her life, and I still don't know how she does it. He came to me with a ledger and showed me calm as a man explaining weather. Not proud of himself, just sure. That is what the right work looks like from the inside. And then, between those entries, the small, unremarkable ones that reminded you this was a man's actual notebook and not a document prepared for anyone. Corn's late this year. Ground's too wet still. New coffee pot. Rebecca was right about that. Samuel read them all, slowly. Some he read twice. Neither of us spoke much between them, and we didn't need to. Early Samuel works the land as though it already belongs to him. I do not say this to settle the question. I say it because watching him is like watching a man come home. But coming home is not the same as having earned the right to stay, and I need to know the difference before I make any decision that cannot be unmade. Later, I spoke to Samuel plainly today, 2 years after the December announcement. I asked him whether there was anything else he'd ever wanted outside of this. He looked at me with the expression a man has when the question is so far from anything he's ever considered that he needs a moment to locate it at all. And then a single line on its own page, written later still, in a slightly shakier hand. Samuel, the land knew before I did. Samuel read that last line twice, quietly, and then closed the notebook and held it in both hands, looking down at the cover. I never knew he was watching that closely. He wanted us being. The entries about me came at intervals across many years, and I want to give them to you plainly the way Samuel read them to me, because they are the ones that finally answered the question I had carried since I was 10 years old, and they answered it quietly the way my father did everything. He always has. And a few years later, Eli built his first cabinet today without Jacob looking over his shoulder. I could tell from the doorway. And later, I've thought about the farm and Eli more than about any other single question across these years, but I believe he would have run it the way a man runs something that doesn't belong entirely to him, with competence and duty rather than love. Give him the farm would have been to give him a gift that cost him a greater one. I do not think I have the right to do that. And then, near the end of the notebook, in the shakier hand of his last years, Eli built a bench set for the district 2 years after his marriage. I sat on one of those benches at the Zook hosting last fall. The joints are clean. The grain is read correctly throughout. There is not a single board in that set cut against the wood. Samuel finished reading and closed the notebook and set it on the desk between. Outside, a horse somewhere in the barnyard shook its head, and the sound of the halter carried in through the window. I thought about the October hosting when I was 10, and my father standing near the barn doorway, watching Samuel in the yard, and writing in the notebook that evening while I crept back upstairs with my cup of water. He spent his whole life discovering who we were, I said finally. Samuel looked up. He was trying not to choose them for, and he kept it all those years, rather than letting someone fix it proper. We sat there a while longer. Outside, across the fields, Samuel's own sons were doing the evening chores, the sounds of it drifting faintly in through the window, the same sounds that had drifted in through that same window for our entire lives. What do you want to do with the notebook? Samuel asked finally. Keep it, I said, where he'd have wanted it, I think, and I put it in my coat pocket. And we went outside together and helped with the evening chores, the way our father had taught us, without needing to be told twice. I want to tell you about the years after, not to rush them, only to give them their proper place. He told me, some weeks after the papers were signed, that he'd gone out alone to the north field that evening, the one he'd learned to read from his father before he'd known he was learning anything. Nothing in the end, Samuel said. That was the strange part. I expected to feel something large. Instead, it was just the same ground it's always been. I think that's what the gift was, actually. Not the paper. The fact that by the time the paper arrived, I'd already been home long enough that it felt ordinary. Just a home, finally settled properly. A father who watches as closely as Irish did and couldn't tell that I didn't want that far. Please. He was just waiting for me to be old enough to say so out loud, so I know he was listening. No, he said. It would bother me if he'd been judging us. He wasn't judging. He was paying attention. There's a difference. Every one of us, our whole lives, just wanted someone to actually see us. He saw us. He wrote it down. That's not a violation. That's the most loving thing I can think of. I've thought about that a great deal since David said it. I think he was right. Sir and I hosted church at our own house many more times across those years, and I want to tell you about the last one we hosted together, because it closes something in the story that I want closed gently rather than left open. It fell on a mild day in early October, close to the same time of year as that first hosting Sunday of my childhood, close to the same shade of morning light through the same kind of windows, and I found myself standing in the yard waiting for the buggies, thinking about my 10-year-old self standing at the end of the lane, watching my father watch the arrival. I had begun carrying it with me occasionally, the way he had, not to write in it, just to have it near. Buggies came down the lane. I watched them come. I watched the way people climb down from them, the way a man helps his wife, the way a child runs straight for the yard before anyone says she can, the way a boy of 14 hesitates near the barn instead of joining the men. I didn't write any of it down. I just watched. Bishop Fisher's successor, a younger man named Isaac Esch, arrived last, as Bishop Fisher had always arrived last. And I thought, standing there watching him come down the lane, that some things in a community are passed down without explanation, simply assumed and continued. The way the timing of a bishop's arrival can become its own small tradition without anyone ever quite deciding it should belong. Benches. The wait of 3 hours. The rocking bench in the back row near the wall, where I'd placed as long as I could remember. At the FOSPA, I stood near the kitchen doorway with my cup of coffee and watched the room the way I had always eventually come to stand and watch it. An elderly woman adjusting another woman's bonnet, quick, certain fingers, not making a ceremony of the correction. 2 girls of maybe 8 or 9 sharing a piece of pie by the simple expedient of each taking a bite in turn from opposite ends. A man of 70 setting down his cup to help a neighbor with a dropped napkin, bending slowly, straightening slowly, handing it back without comment. Nothing dramatic. Just life, doing what life does when people decide to do it together. Sarah appeared at my elbow. She handed me a second cup of coffee, which meant she had noticed me looking empty-handed, standing somewhere watching and not telling anyone what you see. He had it, and you have it, and he didn't teach it to you any more than Samuel taught himself to read the sky." "I know," Sarah said. "I said it to him once, actually. Years ago, when I noticed the same look on him. He said, 'Rebecca notices it too.' And then he didn't say anything else, entirely and unexpectedly content in a way I couldn't have described if someone had asked me to. He died peacefully in the house we grew up in, surrounded by his own children and grandchildren, and I stood at his graveside on a gray March morning and thought about the boy of 17 who had sat in that front room and heard my father give the farm away to a child who didn't want it, and had said only, 'I trust you,' and had meant it completely, and had never once, across the decades after, given any sign that the trust had been misplaced. Hold your whole life's expectation quietly in your hands and offer it up without demanding to know why. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people like that. My father, my mother, Samuel, Sarah, and I have tried to be one of them with mixed success, and I consider the trying itself the most important work I've ever done. Dave has gone 5 years past, and most of my sisters as well. Katie is still living near her daughter's family. Sharp in her mind, if slower in her body, and we talk by phone once a week, English telephone being one of those things our district came to accept long enough ago that none of us think twice about it anymore. My hands need more rest between tasks than they once did, and the fine work, the work that needs steady eyes, I leave now to my youngest son, who has his grandfather's hands in the way that skips generations and then comes back, and who has never once needed to be told to run his thumb along the grain before he cuts. One of a set I built myself, years ago, early in my marriage, black walnut from a tree that came down on our farm the winter I was 23. The bench came back to me from the district when they retired. The old set, the leg damaged in a way that made it unsafe for further use as it was. I recognized at the moment I lifted it from the wagon bed, not from any mark I'd left on it deliberately. From the grain, I had spent 3 full days selecting the boards for that set, reading every plank for its particular quality. And when I saw this board again, in this bench, after 30-some years of Sunday mornings in other families' houses, I knew it the same way you know a voice in a crowd without seeing the face. Slow work, careful work, new walnut fitted to old in the way that takes patience, because walnut changes color slightly as it ages, and any shortcut in the matching shows itself eventually, in certain lights, in ways that would bother me even if no one else ever noticed. This evening I finished the final sand. I ran my hand along the seat, feeling for anything my eyes might have missed. Just the smooth, worn warmth of old wood that has been sat on by a great many people across a great many years, the wood going smoky and dark with it, polished not by any intentional effort but simply by use, by the accumulated weight of all the ordinary Sunday mornings it's carried since I built in my own workshop by lamplight on a Sunday evening. I sat on a church bench I built in my 20s and felt what it is to sit on something made by your own young hands, imperfect and real, every flaw visible to you, though perhaps to no one else, and still, after all these years, holding. Some things a man holds on to because they are his work, not his best work, not his finest, just his. I want to tell you some things I haven't told you yet because I want to give you the full shape of the life and not only the parts that connect directly to the mystery. Baptism. First, people outside our community sometimes imagine that children are born into our faith the same way they're born into a family name, automatically, without choosing. That's not how it works. Every one of us, when we come to the right age, generally sometime in our late teens or early 20s, must choose freely whether to be baptized and accept the full commitment of the ordinung or to leave and live differently. We do not shun them for it. Not if they leave before the vow is made. I was baptized the spring I turned 19, kneeling in a room much like the ones that had hosted church my whole childhood, and Bishop Fisher poured water over my bowed head from cupped hands, and I made the promises, and they felt, as I made them, like something I had actually chosen, rather than something that had simply arrived at me from my parents' expectations. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point. A faith held freely is worth something. A faith held because there was no other option offered is something else, and our people have always understood the difference, even when the world outside us has not. I stood in the congregation and watched him kneel, and I remember my father's face that morning. He looked at Samuel kneeling, and there was no surprise in his expression, only a particular settled peace, the look of a man watching something happen that he knew was going to happen, but that still meant something, maybe especially because he knew. 2 of my 5 children spent time away before they made their own choice, living among English neighbors, testing the world beyond our lane. Both came back eventually and were baptized on their own terms in their own time. I don't say more about that than it deserves, which is to say I'm glad they came back and glad they chose freely, and I would have loved them the same either way. Maple syrup season. I meant to tell you about it for some time. We had a small stand of maples along the creek at the edge of our property, enough to tap each late winter, not for any commercial purpose, but for the older, simpler reason that the tapping is there to be done, and that doing it teaches patience in a way that nothing else quite replicates. My father walked the tree line with me every year from the time I was old enough to carry a bucket, and every year he explained the same thing, as though he were explaining it fresh each time, which perhaps he was, at least for his own benefit as much as mine. "He can't make it go faster," he said. "The sap runs when it runs. Your job is just to be ready when it's ready." The syrup itself, when it finally came, thick and sweet from the boiling, my mother sending food down to the outdoor fire mid-afternoon, all of us gathered around the pot in the steam in the late winter cold, the bare maples against the gray sky, the first pale hint of green nowhere yet but coming. Maybe because it's a season that requires you to simply wait and then show up. And there's a kind of relief in that. I should tell you about the quilts, because the quilting was a whole other social world that ran alongside our own, and that I only understood fully by watching Sarah move through it. The quilting circles rotated through the district the same way the church hosting did, gathering at one house or another through the colder months. 10 or 12 women around a large frame, their needles moving through the layers with the patient precision of people who have done a thing long enough that the difficulty of it has gone beneath their conscious attention and left only the pleasure of the doing. I asked Sarah once what they talked about all those afternoons. "Everything," she said. "Same old argument about whether it's better to work the pattern from the center out or from the edge in. Colors faded from what they were, but the pattern's still clear. Log cabin, sunshine and shadow. The blocks fitted together with the particular neatness of people who care about the work for its own sake, and not only for the finished product. I've always felt, looking at a quilt, something of what I feel looking at a well-fitted joint. The pleasure of things made right by patient hands. The knowledge that it will hold." The schoolhouse sat 2 miles from our farm. A single room with a single teacher and children from 6 to 14, learning what a farm child was thought to need. Reading and writing and arithmetic, and the deeper curriculum, which nobody formally listed but everyone understood, of getting along inside a small space with people whose company you have not chosen and will not be able to avoid. My mind wandered to the workshop. My attention preferred anything with a shake to it over anything abstract. I remember my teacher, Berna Esch, catching me one morning tracing the grain of my own desktop with a finger during an arithmetic lesson, my sums unfinished in front of me. "Billy Fisher," she said with the patience of a woman who had seen this before and would see it again. "The desk will still be there at recess." "Are you learning anything from the desk?" she said, which surprised me since it was not the response I'd expect. "And finish your sums and you can tell me about it at recess," she said, and moved on, and I did. And at recess I told her about the grain pattern in the desk, the particular ring structure visible where someone had dropped something heavy years before and left a faint mark that let you see the growth more clearly. She listened to the whole thing. At the end she said, "That's a real kind of knowing, Eli, different from Soames. But read." My father reading, his voice when he read aloud, giving every word its full weight, the sound of the draft in the chimney flue, a low note that changed pitch with the wind outside. David and his account books, my sisters with their various occupations. Samuel not there in those later years, already in his own house with Lydia, but present in the particular way a person remains present in a house they've lived in long enough. Spring evenings, the windows open, the peepers starting up out by the creek, the smell of turned earth from the field, a child's voice somewhere outside past dark, David or me being called in and not quite ready to come in yet. Summer evenings on the porch, my mother shelling peas, my father reading, the fireflies coming up out of the grass, the sky going violet and then dark, a single lamp set in the window to guide the path, the smell of whatever had been cooking all afternoon still hanging in the warm air, autumn evenings smelling of wood smoke and the particular sweetness of apples, my mother's canning finished for the year, the shelves in the cellar full, the harvest in, the cows putting on their winter weight, my father going to bed earlier in autumn than any other season. Not from tiredness exactly, but from the particular satisfaction of a man whose work for the year has been completed properly. These are the things that made up the actual texture of a life, the evenings especially. I knew it vaguely then. I know it more completely now from the distance of 86 years. I am grateful for every ordinary evening I was present enough to notice, which was not all of them, but was more than I sometimes give myself credit for. I want to come back to the workshop now, since that is where I am this evening, and since the bench is here, and since I find, at this stage of a life, that the things I most want to say are best said in the places where I feel most myself. The bench stands on its trestles near the window, the repair finished, the wood smooth and true. Tomorrow I'll aisle oil, and the day after, if the weather holds dry, I'll carry it out to the lane for whoever comes to collect it for the district's use. I've been thinking, sitting with it tonight, about all the places it's been in the 30 years since I built it, the families who have sat on it, whose names I don't know most of, and whose weights and worries and Sunday thoughts I couldn't begin to guess at. An old woman crying quietly during a hymn. The boy fighting sleep in the second hour. Two men sharing a low conversation during the FOSPA. A toddler standing up on it to look out a window, then set back down gently by a hand appearing from somewhere above. None of that is recorded anywhere. No notebook holds it. It happened, and it passed, and the bench carried it all the same. I think this is what my father understood about the hosting, which I only came to understand from living inside it across so many years. When the church moves into a house, it brings everything every person in it is carrying, every sorrow and gratitude and ordinary Tuesday weariness, and it sets it all down together in one room, and the room holds it, and the wood holds it, and then everyone picks back up what belongs to them and goes home, and the house returns to being a house, a little different than before, and something left behind in the walls that isn't quite memory and isn't quite nothing. I have thought a great deal these past few days of working on this bench about the specific Sunday mornings my father spent watching from wherever he had positioned himself to one, the Beeler Sunday in the rain. Some things require a whole life to arrive at properly. This one did. Outside in the lane, I can hear horses. My grandson returning from a Sunday singing, the clop of hooves on the gravel slow and deliberate the way hooves on gravel have always been, the same sound I heard on every hosting Sunday of my childhood, the same sound my father heard on his. The horse knows the way home. It doesn't need direction. It has made this turn 10,000 times. The sound goes quiet, and from the house, through the open workshop window, I hear the kettle begin to whistle, the small rising note of it, and then Sarah's voice calling my name, gentle, not urgent, the way she calls me from wherever I've gotten to when supper is ready or when the evening has moved past where she expected to find me. I've come to think that this is one of the great graces extended to a man in a good marriage, that his wife's patience is somehow larger than his inattention, and that her voice calling him home across the yard is itself a kind of gift he doesn't deserve and receives anyway. I look at the bench in the lamplight, the new leg fitted true against the old seat, the grain mashed as closely as I could match it, the whole thing smooth and level and ready, warm, the way old wood is warm, the way wood gets warm when it's been in a heated room for many hours, the way a hand on it makes it warmer still. An exchange, back and forth, the wood and the hand. My father put his hand on the rocking bench in exactly this way, on the morning the bench wagon first came down our lane all those years ago. I was 10. I thought it was an ordinary gesture. Nothing about my father was ordinary. He was simply quiet enough that ordinary was easy to mistake him for. I leave the bench where it stands and walk to the door, and outside the night is cool, the sky very clear, the stars out in the way they get out here. Away from town lights, innumerable, unhurried, the same stars my father watched from this same lane, and his father before him, and his father's father before that. The kettle is still going. They just become quieter the older you get, until one day you reach for them and find they've stopped pulling. The way a badly fitted joint will sometimes work itself into place over years of use, the pressure of ordinary life doing what deliberate effort couldn't quite manage. I'm not glad about them either. They were simply what it took for me to arrive here, to this evening, to this bench, to this clear particular understanding that my father loved all of us by seeing us, and that seeing is one of the most demanding forms of love there is, since it requires you to set aside what you hope to find and look patiently for what is actually there. I think about that, and I am, in some way I can't entirely name, entirely at peace with every part of it. I closed the workshop door behind me and walked toward the house, the porch light on, the shape of my wife moving in the kitchen window. 62 years of that particular shape in that particular window, and still something in me is glad to see it, which I take to be a sign that I am, in the most important respects, a lucky man. The gravel under my boots, the cool air, the dark fields on both sides of the lane, going down toward the creek where the maples stand, still bare this time of year, waiting for the cold nights and warm days that will start to sap again in their own time. Not mine, not anyone's. I go up the porch steps. The kettle is quieting now, the whistle settling down. Sarah has taken it off the heat. I come inside, and the kitchen is warm, and she is there, and I set my hand on the back of the chair at the table. The chair I have sat in for 62 years of meals and evenings and ordinary nights like this one. The wood warm under my hand the same way the bench was warm, the same exchange, back and forth, hand and wood, the long accumulation of ordinary contact becoming in time something that holds. Sets a cup of tea in front of me. Nothing more is required. Somewhere across the fields a door closes, the sound of it traveling a long way in the night air, and then nothing. And then the deep particular quiet of a farm that has done its work for the day and rested. I put my hands around the warm cup. The old bench is in the workshop, repaired, ready, waiting for whatever Sunday morning comes to claim it next. Some things you carry because you've been asked to. Some things you carry because you can't imagine setting them down. I suspect that's the whole of it. About the bench wagon, I've mentioned it several times, and I've never properly described what it looks like, which seems like an oversight worth correcting. It's a long, open wagon, built for a single purpose. A flatbed with wooden rails along the edges to keep the stacked benches from sliding. The benches going flat, in stacks of 6, held down with rope in a crossing pattern that whoever last loaded them has devised. No two loaders tying the same pattern exactly, so that you can sometimes tell from the knots who loaded the wagon at the last hosting and whether they were in a hurry. The wagon belongs to nobody in particular and to everybody at once. It's maintained by whoever maintains it, which over any given decade is a rotating handful of families who live near enough to store. There is no official record of these maintenance events. They simply have. About the hymns, too. Since I've mentioned them many times, and I want you to understand what I mean when I say we sing them slowly. The earliest editions were printed in the 1500s, some of the hymns written by men in prison who knew they might be executed for what they believed. Some of them were. When we sing them at the same drawn-out pace they've always been sung, we are doing something that isn't only music. You are in it for as long as it takes, and by the time you reach the last syllable, you have carried it long enough that something of it has entered you, whether you were paying careful attention or not. My father, sitting on that bench through service after service, year after year, in house after house around the district. I used to wonder sometimes what he was thinking about during those long hours. Now I think I have a better idea. One more thing about funerals, since they are part of this too. The body stays in the house, in the parlor or the front room, the same room where on hosting Sundays the church benches stood. The same room where, on ordinary days, the family ate and sat and argued about small things and were quiet together. Neighbors come and sit with the body, and shifts through the nights before the burial. This is called sitting up, and it means that the person who has died is never alone, not from the moment of death until the moment the ground closes over the coffin. There is always someone there, sitting quietly in the lamplight, keeping company with the one who can no longer keep company in return. I remember a winter sitting up, very cold, the house settling and ticking around me in the dark, a lamp on the table, and outside the horse in the shed, breathing steam into the air, visible through the small window, its breath rising and disappearing in the cold. Alive out there. I have never felt closer to what I believe about God and death and the continuation of things than in those night hours, sitting up. I built his own coffin later. My son will likely build mine when the time comes, and his hands are better than mine now, and I am glad of it. That is how things move, in a family and in a community, each generation receiving something from the one before it, making it slightly better than they received it and passing it on, not in speeches, not in ceremonies, just in the work, the long patient work, the hands on the wood, the fingers reading the grain, the knowledge that the bench will hold if you build it right, the knowledge that what you build for others will carry their weight long after you can no longer remember their faces. I think I'm nearly done. I want to end, if I can, on a particular image, since images last longer than explanations, in my experience, And since this one has been with me all eve, worn smooth at the seat by decades of use, the particular dark warmth of wood that has been sat on by a great many people across a great many years. The grain is black walnut, which runs straight in good wood and crooked in difficult wood, and somewhere in between in most of the wood you actually encounter, requiring patience and attention and the willingness to let the tool follow what the wood wants rather than what you'd prefer it to do. Tomorrow it goes back to the district, back to the bench wagon, back to the slow rotation of hosting Sundays, house to house, season to season, the same way it has traveled all my adult life, carrying the weight of everyone who sits on it, not noticing the weight, simply holding. My father built 2 benches like this one before the farm took all his hours. I built this set and others. My son will build more when these wear out, and someone will repair those in their turn, and on, the bench wagon moving through the district until the last of our people is gone, and there is nobody left who knows why the wagon moves at all. But tonight it is here, and the bench is here, and I am here, and the lamplight is warm, and Sarah's voice has gone quiet in the kitchen now. The dishes done, the tea cooling in my cup. My father spent his whole life quietly discovering who each of us already was. That is not a small thing. That is, I think, the greatest and most difficult act of love I have ever witnessed, and I had to live 86 years to understand it for what it was. I hope he knew that I would understand it eventually. I believe he did. He was a patient man. I go inside. I leave the bench in the dark.